Hi, welcome to More Christ. Today I'm joined by the amazing James Alison. James is a Catholic theologian, a priest, and an author. He's done a marvelous job of bringing the work of the great French thinker René Girard to the wider public, wrestling with his work in a distinctly theological manner and showing how rich it can be for the Christian tradition. Just then, if I might ask you about Girard, then what drew you first to him and some of those central concerns that we see in your work?
Gosh, well, when I first came across Girard, I think one of the first things that struck me reading him was because of his understanding of how human desire works. I found myself being read by him. It was as though someone had told me who I was. Someone was telling me who I am. It's a strange sensation when you realize that the person you're reading is reading you rather than the other way around. someone who tells you a great deal of truth about who you are. So that was my first sensation. The second thing was I understood fairly quickly that because of his understanding of the scapegoat mechanism, he'd opened up a completely new paradigm for understanding Christ's death and why that is salvation. Entirely outside the previous patterns, which particularly in the Protestant world, but to some extent in the Catholic world, involved it being necessary for Jesus to die to pay the price for some sins in order to satisfy a wrathful Father. Girard's understanding opens a completely different approach on exactly the same reality. When you start to sink into it, it makes so much more sense of all the scriptural texts than the previous paradigm, if you like, the previous model. So that was the second thing. Then the third thing was, as I began to read Girard, it suddenly made the text of Scripture come alive. You suddenly could see that there was an inner dynamic to what was going on there that made sense. It wasn't, just these ancient texts that you needed endless rather dry archaeological expertise to extract a tiny little bit of meaning out of them here and there. But that actually there was something going on there that was live, living, life-giving, and just made sense of so much of what was going on. So that was my experience.
Brilliant, thank you. And next, if we might, can we talk about Jesus, the forgiving victim, and some of your works then? So that book is comprised of 4 books of essays and is an excellent introduction to the Christian faith. We begin with book 1, Starting Human, Staying Human. And the introduction to the Christian faith starts then with the assumption that as we become more aware of the dimensions of being human that we in fact know already, so then the life of faith which God births within us will become richer and easier to explore and to live. Can you tell us a bit about how this theological anthropology plays out and how it contrasts with other worldviews or indeed the Christianity that we may be used to?
Well, strangely, I think it's very traditional, but it does assume that that being human is a good thing, and that Christian faith is received to us bodily, if you like. It's bodies in relationships that are being moved by the Spirit of God, and so it's how how we're brought to life by having various different human dimensions of ourselves, including our memory, our capacity to imagine, all of these things brought to life. How we become better storytellers. And that element, I think, is very important. Remembering that we never start at the beginning. We always, nice, tidy, logical people always think, well, one must start at the beginning. But in fact, we're always interrupted in reality. We're always starting to tell a story in the middle, after we've reached a certain place of understanding where we begin to start to look back and begin to make sense of where we are. So we're heading forward, looking backwards the whole time. And of course, the gospel presumes that. It's the interruption in our midst of someone who alters our storytelling capacity and creates a new capacity for story in our midst by readjusting all our relationships together. That's what the crucified and risen Lord appearing to the apostolic witnesses after the resurrection does. And the Gospels explain how that happens. Well, you can actually see the dynamic at work. Once you start to read it in that way, you say, oh gosh, yes, I can see this is the dynamic they were trying to point out to. So it's a much more dynamic understanding of, if you like, religious learning. It's us being brought into being through a shift in our relationships with each other that is being taught by Jesus.
Wonderful. And then in book 2, you say God, not one of the gods, and you approach the scriptures in a conscientious but relaxed manner to get us inside some of these key issues that the writers were wrestling with. So we read the scriptures through the eyes of the forgiving victim, as St. Luke teaches us to. What does that mean? And how does this maybe contrast with our more common approaches to the Bible again, I guess?
Well, you don't ask the small questions. Because the Bible is a book, or at least it's presented to us as a book, we tend to treat it alongside other books as if bookishness were a particular quality of learning, if you like. How we learn principally is through texts. And particularly when it comes to the Bible, legal texts. And that's a very misreading understanding of the Bible. Which is not to say that there aren't legal texts in it, but they're not legal in the way that modern legal texts are. This is not, as it were, God's constitutional law book. Rather, and I think this is an important thing, it's a series of monuments to God interacting with people over time. Like, it's the things that are thrown up as a result of God having interacted with people over time, as people have been able to bear witness to it. And this was something that, thank heavens, was brought out really, really well by Vatican II. Vatican II, by understanding that in verbum, in De Verbum, brought out how it's deeds and words rather than words and deeds is what God does that becomes speakable. That's the process, which culminates in what Jesus did and the speaking that becomes possible from that. But so it means beginning to start to have a look at the texts of the Hebrew Scriptures as the undoing of death and sacrifice by Jesus dying for us, is something which is being prepared for throughout the Scriptures as what we call monotheism starts to become visible. So it's if you like, it becomes the texts which bear witness to a process, a dynamic that's going on that was fulfilled in a certain sense at Pentecost. When the living presence of God came amongst us itself to teach us from within and to take us as insiders into the life of God, rather than being something which pointed to that from outside, and in which we were dependent on people authoritatively passing us it on from outside. So my first task, if you like, in that section of Jesus is attempt to, in a sense, get people to stop being frightened of the book of the Bible as if it was a series of very nasty pieces of violence that are somehow God threatening punishment, and to begin to see how it, in fact, it's the undoing from within of precisely that violence, and that violence becomes clearer and more exact the more you're got off it. In other words, it becomes clearer and clearer what's going on and how God has nothing to do with violence. The closer you get to the final undoing of the violent picture of God, which emerges when Jesus is the victim of our violence and gives himself into that violence so as to let us off it. The undoing from within, if you like, of our world of violence. So it's a massive project, if you like, of us, God teaching us not to project our violence onto God, so that we can learn who we are and cease to be violent with each other. So yeah, that's in a nutshell. That's,
Beautiful, yeah. Thank you, James. And you then go on in book 3 to speak about this difference that Jesus makes. So you're already speaking to it there, but are there any other ways that we might consider about how this increased awareness of being forgiven allows us for our participation in a new unity, and how does it call us out to form a new people distinct from who we were?
yeah, well, let's look at it this way. If the standard way of forming groups, which we see in all our cultures and all our societies, modern and ancient, is to gang together with a group of the like-minded over against someone. That's typically how it works. And that's short term, that's very successful. You get a whole lot of people worked up about, I don't know, immigrants, gypsies, whatever. You name your marginal group that can be got in the back of the neck, and you can get unity over against it. And for the short time, that's very successful, except that it's a fake unity, because nothing really has been resolved in terms of peaceful living together. Whatever the real issues about peaceful living have been put to one side to enable people to have a quick shot of unity and feeling good about themselves. And that's idolatry, quite simply. And what the gospel offers is the reverse of that. It's Jesus occupying the space of the cast out one who gave us our fake unity. And saying, okay, you're inclined to do that. Now I'm occupying this space, so you don't need to do this anymore. And furthermore, any of you who see that this is what you're doing, you can be forgiven. I'm not doing this to rub you in your face. I'm doing it so that you can actually start becoming relaxed about how you come together and start to be able to construct ways of being together that are for each other rather than simply against a convenient other. In other words, as former persecutors, you can only build temporary, violent forms of unity. As a forgiven former persecutor, you can start to be brought into being with other former forgiven persecutors, into a new way of being human together. And that is what is meant by the church. That's what this new community is, people who are reconciled to God.
Excellent. And in book 4, Unexpected Insiders, then you speak to this, and I want to ask you, what does it mean then to be inducted into this human story in which death doesn't have the final say? And maybe even counterintuitively, what are some of the main challenges that actually flow from this?
Well, I think inductively is the word, because this is the work of the Spirit. Allowing us, taking us on the inside of a project and allowing us to become someone whom we didn't know we were, which turns out to be who we really are. And this happens in a number of ways, through some of the examples I give, through prayer, through texts. Those are the two that I think I concentrate on most. These are parts of the being brought into that new community. And prayer is the way in which we have our pattern of desire altered, so that the one who desires through us is not the usual bunch of rivals and enemies who in fact run us. Because the more you get locked into conflict with someone, the more they in fact run you. You become a symptom of them. And the more people become in rivalry with each other, the more like each other they become, the more hooked on each other they become. Strangely, the more dependent for who they are. Whereas the whole point of the Spirit of God is the Spirit of God is actually the undoing of that, so we can become someone relatively free of rivalry, start actually imitating models rather than being stuck in fights with rivals. So that's one of the ways we're brought into the inside, as we're able to do that. So we're able to start to stretch out to people in need without feeling that they're threatening to us, which enables charity and mutual upbuilding to go on. So that's one of the things that goes on with prayer. The central, if you like, for me, the central point, which from what I can remember, that I bring out in the joy, in the session on prayer in Jesus the Living Victim, is how dependent we are on approval for our sense of being, and how what Jesus is teaching about prayer, go into your pantry or larder, go into the room which has no windows. So when you shut the door, no one can see you and you can't see anyone, which means that for once in your life, you stop acting up to try and curry favor or attention, to try and be in the good books of someone. You're no longer acting out so as to please someone else. And that's a difficult space. That's a difficult space because suddenly you're in detox from all the sources of approval that you normally rely on in order to flourish. You think, if they approve of me, then I'll become someone. I'll do what they think is good, and then they'll like me, etc., etc. That's how we survive. We depend on the approval of others. Jesus is a point of saying, if you do these things, I tell you, you will have your reward, but it'll be the wrong reward. It'll be too cheap a reward. They will give you your identity, but it will be the identity of a puppet of their desires. Whereas if you spend time going through the detox of that, you will find yourself, after a period of loss and disorientation of not knowing who you are and wondering whether you'll ever be approved of by anybody, discovering yourself a son or daughter of God, because that is the one who sees in secret, who brings you into being. In other words, Jesus doesn't say you must give up this need for approval. He says, of course you need approval, but look for it in the right place. Don't get junk approval.
Yeah, wonderful. I love that emphasis in your work and in Father Henri Nouwen as well about the beloved and the prodigal son. I think you both bring that really to the fore, and especially now, maybe in the internet age where people are tempted, I guess, even physiologically, psychologically, and everything, with the way the media is, the social media in particular, is structured. You're constantly getting those hits of dopamine and different, or whatever it is, serotonin, and you're constantly looking for that validation with likes and tweets and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, thank you for that, James. And that book.
It's independently of media because it happens in real life also. I mean, just think of
And that book you mentioned there, The Joy of Being Wrong, Original Sin through...
Yes, that was a slip up. Slip of the tongue. It was an earlier book. Yeah.
No, can we speak about that? I want to ask you.
Of course, yeah.
Because I think in there you also overturn many of our misconceptions, I would say. So using the wonderful work of theological anthropology, you look at this original sin in light of the resurrection. Why is original sin then a vital perspective on what it is to be human whenever it's seen with resurrection eyes?
Okay, I think the reason I think it's important is because what it's saying, and this sounds counterintuitive, so you have to allow me to follow through. What it's saying is that forgiveness is prior to creation. In other words, it's not the case that there is something which is basically good and stable, and that has been unfortunately screwed up. And now we have been forgiven by some sort of divine decree or act, paying the price. So now, as long as we behave ourselves, our original sin can be forgiven and we can become good again. Okay, that's very often how it's presented. And the reason I think that's misleading is that it makes original sin dominate the story rather than making forgiveness dominate the story. And the whole point of the New Testament is that the ultimate reality of God, since before the creation of the world, is bringing us into being as ones who can forgive and be forgiven. In other words, original sin, the doctrine of original sin is, if you like, the way of saying your creation starts in the middle, and it starts from the process of being forgiven. Humans are the animal for whom being created depends on forgiveness. And the reason I think that's important is because it actually brings moralism to an end. If we're all part of a screw up, then the adventure of creation is the undoing of the shortcut that we've got trapped in and the opening up of the fullness of something. And we're being gradually let out of it. And that seems to be the gospel picture. The gospel, this is how St. Paul talks about a creation bowed down in futility, but now has been opened up so that we can have the glorious liberty of the children of God. And that's a very ancient Hebrew way of understanding it, as though creation bound down into futility is everything is there, but not quite there. There's a kind of an and that is something that we are tied down into. And that what Jesus said, that being tied down into it, was very much linked to the world of sacrifices, repeated sacrifices, and hoping something would turn up. But what Jesus is occupying that space, undoing it, he opened that up, so that now creation is open, it's alive. We are on the inside of it. That element of frustration, of vanity, is over. And that therefore, original sin, rather than being some curse or something that we ought to feel terribly guilty about, no, the whole point of it is simply saying forgiveness is prior to creation. Your access to being created is through forgiveness. This is what humans are. Humans aren't people who were born good and then each one does something terribly wrong. The way in which humans actually become human is through forgiving and being forgiven. And this is very counterintuitive, because we say, but how can you be forgiven before being created when there's not a you there to be forgiven? You say, what it looks like in the midst of time, from our point of view, is not what it looks like from God's point of view. God doesn't have a point of view. What it looks like from God's acting in our midst. It talks about the lamb slain before the foundation of the world, with understanding that the self-giving that was manifest in Jesus was always there. It was always there. It was there before Adam. It was there before Cain. It was there before Abel. And it became manifest in our midst. But that was the fullness of the dynamic of creation that became manifest. Excuse Nicholas while he jumps off. He's decided that he's had enough of my lap. Nicholas is the French bulldog who's just left my lap, for those of you who are watching and weren't introduced to him at the beginning.
Yeah, that's beautiful, James. And there's something else that I think that really comes across, maybe an ecumenical emphasis. So in some ways, I think you and Girard bring East and West together again by applying mimetic theory to original sin. Do we then fill out this older, maybe Western picture that has become more popular, maybe after St. Augustine, not to make him a whipping way, and bring that into contact with theosis and basically what you're saying there?
Yeah, I mean, each one of our traditions has their what's their word? Their way of grabbing everything and turning it into moralism, both West and East. So I don't think either side has particular bragging rights to brownie points in this in this area, though each side likes to show how it's better than the other. Really, the question of allowing the gospel to be a gospel of grace, and for it continuously to be a gospel of grace, and therefore for our learning process not to be one of moralism, but to be one of being brought to life. That's a difficult package to keep alive from generation to generation. And I think that it's difficult in the East and it's difficult in the West. I think that words like theosis, interpreted right, help. But I'm not what's the word? All glistening-eyed about how wonderful it is in some places, how much greener the grass is on other hills. Grass is pretty brown on most hills at this stage.
Yeah, unfortunately, I have similar views and the experience to back it up, I think. So yeah, definitely. Thanks for that, James. And how then do we see anew the central doctrines of the Christian faith from this perspective? Or are there any examples would you like to mention to bring the point home further? Or I think you've done a wonderful job already.
Well, fill the question out a bit so to give me more of an idea of where you would like me
I think
to go.
I think one element might be the more mythic origin story of individualism and enlightenment that we have, that has maybe come into the church from outside the culture, maybe to Rousseau and people like that. And this obviously affects us, how we perceive the gospel, I suppose. Or are there any tangents like that?
Yeah, well, of course, I mean, in one sense, of course, individualism and enlightenment, and so these are, in some sense, bastard children of revelation. It's not as though those could have arisen without the gospel, but the fact is that they're partial receptions of the gospel, and in some senses, that's been the way that we have. Our culture has been a series of partial receptions of the gospel that are then nudged out by other partial receptions of the gospel that are opposed elements. So for me, the question is how to keep alive the central dynamic that both shows how we are being brought into being as selves who are, in one sense, unique bodies, but how that's not the same as being an individual. That's what Girard calls an interindividual. In other words, it's in our relationship with others that we become who we are. It's the in-between that makes us who we are, not the inside. And this is something which individualism finds very difficult, because the individualism myth is that of the self-starter. It's more difficult, and you have to be a great deal more humble if you realize that actually it's in your relationship with someone else that you come to be who you are. And in fact, it's all your relationships with other people that are turning you into who you are. And that as those become relationships of love, of compassion, of mercy, and so forth, it's actually you who are being let go as you let go outside yourself. But that makes us much more malleable. Us as personal histories, personally embodied narrative histories, which is what we are, makes us much more vulnerable, much more precarious, much more malleable. But that's a good thing. But it also brings out how, if you like, how certain stories, for instance, about our supposed goodness or our profound badness, turn out curiously to be ways of protecting us against ourselves, rather than allowing us to undergo this process of being transformed from within relationally with each other. And I think that's one of the challenges for us, how to keep that dynamic, the dynamic of the Holy Spirit ultimately is what it is, alive, in enabling us to be brought into being by bringing each other into being. And how that involves inhabiting a dangerous world where the reverse can happen. We can shrink back into binary oppositions, which seem more fun and sexy and give us a quick fix of identity, but ultimately are self-destructive and dangerous for other people. And we're clearly going through a particularly nasty phase of that in Western so-called democracies recently, with a very clear return to binary and fear-ridden identities. So, I think that absolutely central to that is how we present in our preaching, in our living out of the gospel, the life of our Lord as one who occupies the place of shame, such that we no longer need to be triggered by our shame and our fear, but able to inhabit, accept, and therefore become precarious, vulnerable, and therefore able to stretch out towards others and learn That seems to me to be what's central. The undoing of sacrificial mechanisms enables learning, because it makes people vulnerable and cooperative, which is what allows learning to happen. The recrudescence of sacrificial mechanisms gives people hard knowledge, things that they know apparently, but which are all forged against other people. And that's a fast route to conspiracy theory, where you know in advance whatever the evidence, because you are right. And it's much more important that you and your group be right than that anyone learn anything. So, I think that really central to where we are at the moment in all our countries is how are we going to recover the relationship between the sacrificial world in which we become good sacrifices with Jesus as our sacrifice making us good, or Jesus' sacrifice where he gives himself into our midst and we recognize ourselves as former persecutors who are able to sit and stand in our shame and therefore learn to collaborate and cooperate together. It's a rather different picture of flourishing, but I think it's an absolutely vital one.
Excellent, thank you.
Going forward.
And another key revolution that you focus on is how we view desire, which I think is most important. How are we to understand desire in the triune God, maybe contrasted with our idolatrous desires, and I guess those notions of autonomy and things that we were speaking about?
Well, that's a slow one. That takes us back to what we were talking about before, because by desire, I understand the specifically human set of longings that are more than just appetites, which happened when we ceased to be run merely by appetite and instinct as higher apes, and actually found that there was a group way of being together that caused how each one of us was brought into being and started to learn and touch along. In other words, desire is how the social other reproduces itself in us. It starts with the other, and we are brought into it by imitation. Because that's what we are as humans. We're particularly good imitators. We're much better imitators than any other animal. So through imitation, our social other reproduces itself in us, makes us, if you like, good member by learning to do what the others do, by picking up the mixture of sound and gesture that eventually constitutes language, so that we're able to speak and communicate and pass a huge amount of information to each other. All of that depends on desire, what Girard calls mimetic desire, the capacity to imitate. And that's a wonderful thing. It's a good thing. Human desire is essentially a good thing. It's what enables us to be brought into viable social life with each other. But it's also at the same time a dangerous thing, because while imitation is good and through it we learn and come together a huge amount by comparison with our nearest ape relatives, they also do to a certain extent, but nothing like to the same extent as we do. It's also terribly dangerous, because the more we imitate, the more we run the risk of rivalry, because the more you imitate someone, the closer you get to be like them. And the closer you get to be like them, the more risk there is that your capacity to get whatever it is they want will be as great as or greater than theirs. So designated objects which were teaching you how to learn something can suddenly become something that you need to fight about with. And it's very, very easy that your model becomes your rival. And then the very same passion that made you a good disciple makes you a bitter rival. And this affects every aspect of our life, our emotional life, our sexual life, our digestive life. Every one of these, every one of our human instincts is affected by this danger of imitation becoming rivals. So, I mean, why this matters so much for the gospel is that it's as we learn to imitate in a self-giving way that undoes rivalry, that we find ourselves actually able to love and do each other good. We find ourselves taken out of rivalry with each other. And of course, that's what Jesus did. He made that possible by going up to his death for us, so that death no longer needs to be a concern about rivalry. Because ultimately, death is the ultimate guarantor of rivalry. You need to fight, and you need to be the one who wins. If you don't need to win, you're no longer run by death. And so you don't need to be a rival to anyone. So you can learn to love, and you can start to stand up for each other, all of those things. So that's something about how that pattern, the undoing of rivalry works, and how that important that is in desire. And after that, well then, the other forms of desire, our eros can be trained so that we actually start to be able to want to build each other up rather than to devour each other. This can have physical consequences. Our eros can be turned into agape. It can become agape over time in bodily relationships. All of this is a process of learning. We would now call a process of sanctification. But that's how this works. Yeah. Sorry, was that where you wanted to?
No, that's
to go?
perfect. Yeah, thank you, James. I don't know if the next part of that, I don't know if I have a coherent enough question, but I'll try. I guess because it's pretty revelatory to me in some ways. So, I'm wondering, how can we can you describe maybe how Girard's work exposes the myth that we are primarily rational individuals? I think you're already hitting on that, and how whenever we apply mimetic theory to evolution, this shows that the binaries is sacred, and survival or violence are in contact from the beginning of history itself, and how that desire to sacrifice to the gods has always been there. I think in our maybe overly rationalist conception, we don't understand that. And then the political order and everything has this sacrificial element, and we're just baffled why are people not behaving in a rational manner.
In a rational way, yeah. Yes, it is true. I mean, that's one of the things which Girard brings out very well, as does a good deal of modern psychology and psychiatry, which is that we are relational before we are rational. In other words, what makes it possible for you or I to have what we call the use of reason is not something separate from the whole process of us being brought into collaborative relational being with others. It's the process of allowing ourselves to have been given a memory, a narrative capacity over time that enables us to become able to start to say, I want this, I do that, you do this, why do you do that, etc., etc. In other words, and I think that this is a fundamental distinction. People who think that rationality is somehow independent of relationality are always going to be surprised by every form of reality, because it's always how people are relationally that throws up how they talk rationally. And therefore, what we call rationality at its best is always self-critical relationality. How we learn to work out what's really going on, despite the first impressions, which usually come about through bad ways of being together. And it's why, generally successful scientific projects are always the fruit of years of collaboration and learning how not to be rivals with each other, so as precisely to be able to see what is in front of your nose. When you're all rivals, you can't see what's in front of your nose. You can only see each other. A fantastic example just last week, the reaction of the governor of Texas to the effects of the snowstorm and blizzard on the Texas energy grid. Okay, the Texas energy grid has been entirely dependent on a very particular series of deliberate political and economic decisions concerning quick money making and profit making, not providing a resilient state. In other words, it was always a partisan effort rather than a service. And then, of course, when it's actually hit by something that wasn't imagined, rather than the first reaction to it being, okay, we're in this mess. Let's see how we can get out of this together. The first reaction, and always the easiest and sexiest reaction, is immediately to find someone else to blame. Rather than saying, stop, we must undo the way in which our previous way of being together has in fact caused this terribly dangerous and difficult problem for all of us.
Mm-hmm.
People would far rather to have the quick shot of cheap meaning that seems to resolve a particular problem now than actually spend time trying to work out what is objective, what is real, what is not a function of immediate relational solutions. And I think that for us humans, that's a terribly difficult thing to do. It's always easier to resolve things by a fight within the group than it is to say, let's give up fighting the group and have a look and see what's actually there, whether it's climate change or an attack by fire ants or whatever the whatever the presenting issue is, or a COVID, an invisible virus. Our first preference is relational, a relational resolution, a quick relational resolution that makes us feel good, rather than the slow, let's get our relationships together in such a way that we may actually look at what is going on rather than merely see ourselves and our enemies in a battle. Time and time again, the relational, we assume and we make use of the intellect, reason as something weaponized within pre-existing relations, rather than seeing how we might shift relationality in order to have clearer insight into the real.
Most fascinating. Thank you, James. And I want to ask you next about something that David Cayley has spoken about, if I can maybe articulate this. He seems to suggest that we're in this new and darker age of the Antichrist in a very nuanced way, I must say. It's maybe struggling to get it. So do you see this kind of playing out where it's harder to pretend precisely because of Christ's revelation that the victims are guilty, and we have to resort to ever more elaborate lies to sustain the deception, even from, I guess, pre-Christian times, or whenever, I guess, they knew they were religious, whereas nowadays we don't know that we're religious? I guess, again, speaking to that overly rationalistic conception of ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read David Cayley's latest book, which I think has just come out, which deals with this. So I'm not well informed to be able to answer you
Sure.
very exactly. But if what you're talking about is, if you like, the way in which victimization has become everybody's game. In other words, the way you try to get brownie points is by playing the victim. Yes, of course, that is the anti-Christian in the very specific sense. It's the mockery. It's the mocking mimicry of Christ. It looks like the real thing. It sounds like the real thing, and in fact, it's exactly the reverse of the real thing.
We may love to take it back to Knowing Jesus, which was the first book I read of yours, this early and now classic, I would say, book. It asks us what it is to know Jesus. So you introduce us to many new theological insights, I suspect, or I think, and one of which is the intelligence of the victim. What does this mean, and how does it differ from our maybe standard worldly logic and our view of history that we're sort of hitting at before?
Well, if you like, when I coined that term, the intelligence of the victim, this is roughly what I meant about it. I was thinking about how in the gospel Jesus knows what's going to happen to him. He's entirely clear-sighted about it. He knows the mechanisms that are going to lead to that, not because of some, esoteric knowledge, but because he understands what it is to be human and how humanity works. So he's like a scout deep in enemy country, reconnoitering. And at the beginning of the gospel, he can see when the lynch is threatening to happen. He's able to stand outside it on various occasions. He's able to stand back. He knows when to provoke, when not to provoke. In his own words, being as innocent as a dove and as wise as a serpent. This is the scout in enemy territory who knows exactly how the system works, and who knows that he is going to give himself into the midst of that to actually explode the whole system, but is doing so peacefully and lovingly, and yet with a genuine intelligence understanding of what's going on. But when I say genuine intelligence, I mean a human understanding of what's going on, not esoteric information, but a genuine something which will understand the structure of being human, the structure of human societies, how people are going to behave, the mechanisms that kick into play, the dynamics that are at work. So it seems to me that that's something which is part of what the Holy Spirit teaches us and gives us, takes us into the intelligence of the victim. It makes us aware that we are very often in enemy territory, not because the people we're dealing with are our enemies, nor because the world is an evil place, neither of which is true, but because the mechanisms and the dynamics which are those of this world are those which ultimately tend to cast out. And the question is how to give ourselves into this generously, unfrightenedly, in such a way that it brings other people to life and make our lives of a gift in the midst of this. And it's not easy for any of us because we all start on the wrong side. Unlike Jesus, we all start on the wrong side. We all start as people who, in order to be taken into this vision, need to undergo being forgiven first. So it's a process of learning how to step out of the mechanisms and then see our way free to be able to give ourselves non-resentfully into what's going on and realize that this is a being brought to life and it's an enormous privilege and a joy. Something like that. It does that.
Beautiful, yeah. And you also, I think, bring together what has been a very divisive thing between Catholic and Protestants in some ways, like I was speaking about before, between East and West, that the emphases come together. So you look at justification by faith in a really refreshing way. Can you tell us a bit about how we might understand this, considering the intelligence of the victim then?
Gosh, again, you don't ask the light questions. And it's such a long time since I wrote Knowing Jesus that I can picture the chapter visually in my mind. I'm not sure that I have immediate access to it intellectually. I think that what I wanted to show is that it's, as we see the one who occupies the space of being thrown out by us. So as we're aware that that one has occupied that space generously, we suddenly realize that he didn't do that in order to rub our noses in it. It wasn't, I'm going to do this, I'm going to have you kill me so that I can then say, nah, you're all awful, as some form of, sort of revenge. He's saying, I know you're going to do this. I know that that's what you do. And this is not a good game for you. Ultimately, you destroy yourselves like this. This is not a good game. So I'm going to occupy that space. I know exactly what you're going to do. I know exactly what it's going to look like. And then you're going to be able to perceive me thereafter as one who is giving the entire thing for you. The moment you realize that this whole thing was done for you, the moment you realize that this was a gift rather than an accusation, then you say, oh my God, he likes us. He wasn't out to get us. He just actually doesn't give a damn that we're caught up in this trap. He regards it as of no importance. He passes over all that we've done, pass over our transgressions. But on the contrary, it's because he wants us to be brought to life. And once we understand that his being in that place was an act of love and love for us, well then, we start to be brought alive, and we find ourselves being realigned, which is what justify essentially means, realigned into the life of the kingdom, into the new creation, able to start to be able to recreate relationships with other people and become who we really were meant to be all along. And this is a gift. And of course, it's not something which is a decree. It's a real fact. So it actually genuinely leads us to become more loving, to actually to be able to start, as a result of our faith, having works. And that's the point. Justification by faith is true. What it does is it enables us to actually become people who find ourselves able to love. And this is, if you like, that seems to me to be the central thing. But it's someone who's doing, that's always a group thing. It's not, I've done this to you as an individual, and now you're individually forgiven. So now you can be a good self-righteous bastard and judge all the other people. It's which is very often how it comes across.
Yeah.
It's, I've done this for you, plural, which means each one of you individually can now have the whole of their being together redone. And that's what I'm doing for you, for each one of you, in and between and with each other. That's how you're being brought together into the kingdom of God.
Excellent. Thank you, James. Just moving on to another facet of your work, which I think is most important and profound, the focus on eschatology and taking it away from scaremongering about the future and so on. So you've written a few books like Raise and Able, the recovery of the eschatological imagination. And Raise and Able is a theological exploration of a huge change of mind, the change which the apostolic group underwent because of the resurrection. And you reveal that how that paradigm can transform the world today, especially in relation to the thought of Girard, who you mentioned. So first then, how has the God who was revealed by Jesus, again, you spoke to this already, subverted the violent language, imagery, and expectations of the early Christians even?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that we find, I think, difficult to imagine or to remember, which is that the how do I say this? We typically imagine the account of Jesus's life, death, and resurrection as being kind of, he had a good time teaching, and that was fine. And then he had this rough incident between Good Friday on Good Friday, and that was a bit of a downer. But luckily, there was a happy ending to the story on Easter Sunday, and he got better, and so all's okay. Okay, now the gospel accounts do not show that at all. The gospel accounts, if anything, show quite how clear Jesus made how much the purpose of what he was doing was going towards the ending, was going towards Good Friday, and how difficult the disciples found it to understand, and how they ran away, and all of that. But then what happened on Easter Sunday, rather than being a happy ending, was initially perceived by them as a terrifying beginning, because it was something for which there was no precedent. Because all of us tends to have stories for which the principal parameter is death. We know how to tell stories that end in death. We know how to tell stories that start with death, like detective stories. The place of death in stories is enormously important. And in fact, the place of death in all our cultures is enormously important because it kind of gives a guarantee and a stability, and it teaches us how to behave and to mourn, and so on and so forth. And suddenly, you have someone come into their midst, blow apart the central mechanism for killing people, in other words, the scapegoat mechanism, and then show themselves as not dominated by death. Well, one of the first things that this does is it completely throws a spanner in the works of all our normal storytelling capacity. We suddenly become aware that there is another force, another dynamic that is far greater than anything we have known, that is at work, that has nothing to do with death, and that is making itself available to us for the first time as human story. This is shocking. This is what is, if you like, eschatological. It's the realization that there is a dimension to created reality which our story had no room for. And therefore, that reality is going to shake all our human forms of togetherness, of culture, of solidity, of security. All of that is going to be shaken. Because never again will we be able to just go into a little huddle and say, it's sad, but that's what just death does. So let's just get drunk and have a wake or whatever. Let's just that be the, let's just be sad and mourn. What is the word? Live, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Suddenly, they're saying, actually, that's not what life is about at all. There is vastly more to it. It's vastly more exciting, it's vastly more disturbing, and the consequences of being on the inside of it are vastly greater than have ever been perceived. In other words, this is really, really shocking. And I think that it took the apostolic group a long time to begin to get used to what this actually meant. The notion of the utter aliveness of God actually being a permanent force to which we have access starting now, and which undoes our forms of security, and therefore is tremendously threatening to the normal forms of order, keeping things together, which are done by cover-up and by violence. In other words, something extraordinarily unviolent opens up the possibility of the reaction, a very violent reaction to it, which is what we see in the Acts of the Apostles, and what we see in the book of the Apocalypse. We see how the birthing, if you like, of the new creation in our midst is something, on the one hand, wonderful, peaceful, opening up to life, and on the other, constantly surrounded by imprisonment, danger, death, lynching, the attempts to recreate fake order, because the new thing is too dangerous. And that what Jesus is doing in his eschatological teaching, those parables, is in a sense, is preparing us to live in the midst of that reality, the midst of the reality that he himself would then open up. So that's something of what I was attempting to do in that.
Wonderful.
In that book.
Then again, how does this eschatological imagination and approach to time contrast, I guess, with our dominant culture now that we find ourselves in? So even in the sense, I guess, of how we're always rushing and in a constant state of busyness, although COVID-19 has, I guess, had some impact on that. How does that help us differentiate between the two, I guess?
I think that the question of time is the one that's suddenly brought out by the gift of hope. The gift of hope is an eschatological gift in the sense that part of that utter aliveness that opens out means that we begin to get a sense of a future coming upon us that is already here in sign, and which we're living into by faith. So if you like, by faith, we're able to relax into the fact that it's coming upon us. And by hope, we're being able to be stretched into making it actually alive in our midst. But it's the sense of a future coming upon us, which actually undoes the past, because it undoes the memory, the way we tell our past. The way we tell our past had traditionally been in ways of self-justification, parts of the close down, parts of the convenient story, which made me good by comparison with others. But if something is coming upon us that is the reverse of that, that is opening us up to a new belonging, then it's constantly undoing the way in which we're related to our past, how we're attached to the stories we tell about us, how even our bodies feel about our past, which is why part of the work of the Spirit is undoing trauma and body memories of trauma and so on and so forth. But what that means is we have the very strange thing, which is not typical in of course, in our current understanding, whereby hope works to allow an entirely new present to be made present by the future undoing the past. So yes, it's a very odd sense of time. And it's because we have two sorts of time functioning simultaneously. The eternal time, which is a real form of time because it includes a human coming to being, and the downward spiraling time, if you like, of futility and vanity, in which we're constantly trying to shore up who we are by means of grasping onto a past over against some enemy that is threatening. So yeah, it's a very odd phenomenon, and I think one of the ones that requires most thought about. What is it about Christian faith that allows that which is coming upon us to open us up, including undoing what a sober vision would say is past and therefore can't be altered. But in fact, it's all the relationality that seems to have been formed by the past is in fact being opened up in a new way. It's funny that this was something which was brought out to me by Dennis Turner, a very fine Thomistic theologian, which I hadn't. He reminded me that traditionally, the three virtues have the three theological virtues were attributed in the classical patristic past to three faculties of the soul. So faith was thought to link to reason, what you were supposed to know that was true. This was in a rather mentalist understanding of faith, but that was one that the ancients. Love was, of course, related to the will, because that was how you learned how to love. And guess what was the human faculty that was related to hope? Well, the answer is memory. That which is transformed by hope is memory, just as that which is transformed by love is will, and that which is transformed by faith is reason. It was a very, very interesting picture. But I think that's how we learn to be as ones who are in the midst of things without being in the midst of them. And that doesn't mean in some painful running away type. It means actually being brought to life, being run by a different schedule in the midst of things that are grinding on around us. I think that is a very, very, very essential part of the Christian faith, and it's not part of decrying the world in some evil sense. It's a part of rejoicing in how what it looks like to be human is being taken into a new place.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that, James. And actually,
a pleasure to meet you, and I hope to have the opportunity to do so in the flesh when these, inconveniences, COVID inconveniences are past.
Marvelous. Thank you again, James, and God bless you.